gave him plant material, told him how to plant it, told him the spacing, and Dr. G basically planted what Jim had.
Yeah,
and so
the same sort of spacing and everything as well.
Totally. And so the Gee Vineyard mimicked the St. Clair Vineyard, used that St. Clair clone, and off we go.
Yeah. And one little fun tidbit of history for that vineyard: before Dr. G purchased it, the person who had it prior to Dr. G was a pilot. And so the story goes from the man himself is that the pilot ended up selling this piece of property because it wasn't quite long enough to put a runway in for his own plane. And so when he discovered that this wasn't quite long enough, he said, you're dead to me. You're dead to me, and so I'm going to move on to another spot. One thing I will note, okay, we've got everybody in. There are a couple microphones that might be on and some screens that might be on, and so at some point throughout this presentation, we will ask maybe for some questions, and so we want to make it as interactive as possible if we can. For now, we'll kind of give some history and move on to that. So we've talked about the St. Clair clone being sort of the heart of Dr. G's property, and another really interesting thing about his property is that it's dry farmed. And so when he and his family purchased that property in the early 80s, starting in 81 through, I believe, 84 is when he and his family literally hand planted these vines. And so some important things to do when you're going to hand plant, which sounds easy, you're just going to go put some stuff in the ground. It's not quite that simple. You've got to work the soil. You can have issues. Sometimes you get what's called J-rooting. If your soil is too compact outside of where your shovel goes and you dig this hole, the vine just sort of grows down and then right back up. And so it wasn't quite as easy, and so smart enough, they did it the correct way. They got the soil loose enough, they planted it, they hand watered it for a few years, and then they planted it at the right height. And so you've got a rootstock, and then you've got your scion. If you plant it too low, your scion will just grow into the ground, and that'll cause some issues. Just ask Europe. And so,
going back to that hand watering, so when Eric's talking about it being dry farm and talking about hand watering, they were literally driving a tractor down the road with the kids on the back of the tractor, 5-gallon buckets, and it was a 5-gallon bucket of water per vine that the kids were tossing on, like the whole 11 acres that's planted to this original St. Clair.
Yeah. Not exactly financially feasible these days.
So that's a labor of love.
Definitely a labor of love. And so we've got St. Clair. Going back to dry farm. Dry farming isn't quite as popular these days. It's I don't know, I guess it's risky in a way, especially given the amount of drought years that we tend to have these days in California. But what it does is that it forces or it asks your vines to dig deep into the soil and find their own dang water. It's you're setting it up to struggle for a little while, especially in drought years. But these root systems are going to go deep into the soil, basically as far as they can go, and spread out and find their own nutrients and water. And when you do that, what tends to happen in general is that these vines struggle, and then they end up producing a crop load that's going to be nice and intense in flavors and aromas. So this dry farming it's an older technique, but it's risky, like I said, but the flavor profile and the aromatic profile that you can get from wines like that tends to be real intense, is sort of the best describer of those wines.
And you guys may have heard the phrase, it's on billboards out here in California, that happy cows make happy cheese or happy milk. Well, happy grapevines do not make happy wines. If your grapevine is like super happy, then all that water and all that soil nutrient goes up into the green growth, the leaves and the shoots, and you'll get shoots that are 10 feet long. They just go everywhere. You do not want that in a grapevine. You want a really balanced grapevine where that green growth and vegetal growth is balanced with the amount of fruit on the vine, allowing for this concentration of clusters like Eric's talking about. And so by not watering and by dry farming, those roots have run so deep over 30 years that now you do get some green growth, and then you get these really awesome concentrated clusters. Yeah,
they've sort of learned to temper themselves over the decades that they've been out there. These vines, the combination of where they're grown and the dry farming technique tends to produce a smaller crop load. We're not going to get anything near what a young sort of untested vineyard would get, and so a younger vine would end up throwing a lot more crop. It's going to have a larger crop load on it, versus these old, close to 40-year-old vines are going to have a much smaller crop on that, lending itself yet again to a more intense flavor. And when we say intense, we're not necessarily saying like, oh, it's real jammy or dark fruits necessarily. It's just even when the fruit profile is of a fresher fruit, like a fresh cherry or cranberry or strawberry, something like that, it's just got an intensity in another layer to these wines that makes it really special. What else can we say about his vineyard? It is beautiful too. I mean, it's right across the street. It has a great view of our property and of our terraces. We recently did a Facebook Live out there that showed it. And these vines, they're not maybe what you would expect when you come to Napa Valley. You see a lot of pretty perfect rows when you head up 29. You come out here, and this goes back to actually like my first day on the job in 2015 of July when I started with Bouchaine. Right. I had come from a winery up in Rutherford where every single vine was touched by human hands about 1 million times, it seemed like, and every shoot was perfect and it's beautiful and it makes great wine. And so I came here. Chris says, let's walk across the road. We'll go check out this vineyard that we make wine from called the Gee Vineyard Pinot Noir. I said, sure, sounds great. And so we walk over there, and it's this head-trained vineyard, and there's not a lot of trellis there. There's some old redwood stakes in there. They're real wide spaced. You could drive my Toyota Corolla down the vine rows. They're real wide. It's you could drive a picking truck down these things. And these vines are much fatter than what our vines have here. Even though we have some vines that are about the same age, they've just grown in sort of this tree trunk style.
They've struggled, big old trunks.
And so we walk over there, and it's kind of, compared to where I had been, I had my nose turned up and my pinky up. I was being a little snobby, and I go here and I look at this vine, and it is kind of a mess. And I'm thinking to myself, what did I get myself into with this vineyard? Not
a manicured vineyard at all.
No, but eventually you find the chaos, or the beauty in the chaos, right? Yeah. And so we were just about to bottle, at that point, the 2014 wine that day or the day after. And so we go back to the winery and we taste the wine that's been blended up into tank, and it's amazing. And it's I often talk about the Swan clone sort of being one of our favorite wines that we make here, but like all your children, you love them equally, right? The Gee Vineyard is up there as well. It's just we'll get into that too, but like the actual fruit and aromatic profiles of these wines, but just a really interesting wine that you're not going to find a lot of places, especially in Napa, but in California, really. 40-ish year old dry farm, head trained, St. Clair clone. These are all things that are unique in and of themselves. Even one of these things would make a unique wine, but we've got all these things lining up to make such a really fun wine. It has challenges when it's been farmed this way, and so it's not without those challenges for winemakers especially, but
it's not easy farming.
It's not easy farming, and we don't get out there in the tractors, so it's no skin off our back, but it certainly makes for an interesting harvest when you get there. Okay. Going back to how these things look, as Chris likes to say, it looks like a Pinot bad hair day.
It does. It's just
everywhere. It's like how we'll all look once this pandemic's over. Everyone's hair is just going to be crazy. No one's going to comb anymore. And so, I mean, I wish there was stock in like Great Clips or something like that, because pretty soon it's going to go through the roof. But and so these vines, by their nature, are without all that trellis, something that you'll see elsewhere. They just grow everywhere. This Pinot bad hair day, and so even to find clusters, sometimes you got to like dive into these things. They're so bushy.
Like lifting up shoots to find clusters underneath, just to sample, because the way that we decide when to harvest is to basically go cut clusters off of different vines throughout a vineyard block, and then we smush it all up, sort of like we would making wine, and taste the juice, in addition to tasting the fruit itself off the vine, and then we start thinking about, okay, is this like, 2 weeks off? Is it a week off? Should we maybe harvest it in the next couple days? And so that's how those conversations happen, is actually getting out in the vineyard, looking at it, tasting the fruit, and then smishing up the clusters, tasting that juice.
Yeah.
But trying to find clusters in this vineyard, you're digging under this Pinot bad hair day sometimes.
Yeah, and there's a lot of variability when you have something like that. And so that's why it's real important for us to get out and do a big sampling of this entire vineyard and make a homogeneous sample to really check your numbers and check the taste. One thing I always like to mention, and something that I've learned from Chris, which is highly important for the way we make wine here, is we pick by flavor. If the flavor's not there, we're not going to pick it. We're always going to check our chemistry. We're checking for acid, the pH, the total acidity, or titratable acidity technically, and the sugar levels. And so we check those, and with the Gee Vineyard, we have to make sure we sample really properly. And we'll check those numbers, but if the flavor's not there, then we don't pick it. And so that's something that we really try to do, especially with that Gee Vineyard, because there's all those things that I keep talking about that make it so special. We want to line them up as possible. The other day, when anybody who watched Brian and I speak, I believe it was on Monday, I talked about how a boss I had worked with in the past likened harvest picking specifically to catching a falling knife. And so at that perfect point, you catch that and you pick it. And so the Gee Vineyard, we really want to catch that falling knife as best we can. So challenge accepted. It's one thing that we love to do year after year. Getting over into that vineyard, it's such a joy, which leads into something else that we can talk about, is the man himself, Dr. Paul Gee. I said it earlier, but if there's a vineyard out there that has really sort of emulated, or it's like he's infused his spirit into this
encompasses
vineyard.
his whole personality. I mean, we'll post some pictures on Facebook because he just has the hugest smile.
Always.
This is lovely personality. And a lot of you who have been here have met him, because he comes over here once or twice a week. Not right now, but typically he's over here once or twice a week. He's hanging out, on the terrace. He's signing bottles. He's like...
He's a rock star when it comes to Bouchaine.
Yeah.
But he's just such a wonderful man, and has worked with Bouchaine for decades now. And he's such a joy, and it's just something that's really translated into the fruit itself. He's, every time he comes and visits us, which is often, he's been to some new part of the world, and he's always taken people with him, and just truly a great person. So we encourage all of you to come to Bouchaine, because Paul will likely be here when you do show up. And then, of course, you're going to have to buy some Gee Vineyard Pinot for him to sign those bottles.
And then he might drag you over into the vineyard. He does that sometimes, too.
Yes.
But the other thing we do, and we don't have it scheduled yet for this year, but we will do it because we start getting calls on it as we release the Gee. We do a Gee Vineyard blending seminar in Dr. Gee's barn right across the street every year. And we clean that barn out, and we have it catered. And you sit down with... basically barrel samples and shiners and graduated cylinders, and you make a blend. And whoever's blend gets closest to our actual blend wins wine. But it's really fun to hang out like in the Gee Vineyard, hear Dr. Gee speak about the history. So we're really glad that you're with us today, but we want to bring you in with Dr. Gee at some point. Yeah. So make sure you're on our mailing list, and you'll get notice when we actually get that scheduled. Yeah, it's really fun to get over there and just sort of get a sense of the place and get your hands in the soil and smell it. And we do wish you could be in Napa right now, because the buds are breaking. We've got Chardonnay shoots are probably this big, the Pinot are following behind, but just that smell in the air. And when you get over to Dr. Gee's property, it's even better. Don't tell the Copelands I said that. It smells wonderful here too on our estate. So, Dave, do we have a question?
Yeah, Tim Apple would like to know if winners are able to take their blend home, and also everybody that partakes.
We don't have a problem with that.
I don't have a problem with that at all.
Yeah, Tim, if you win, you can take your blend home and a bottle of Gee.
Nice. What else do we want to say about Paul?
What else do we want to say about Paul?
Or just the wine in general. So when the fruit is harvested, it's usually in sort of the grand scheme of how and when we harvest our Pinot Noirs. in the middle end of our Pinot Noir harvest. It takes a little longer to ripen that fruit, and there is some variability in there, but it's middle end. And so what we tend to do, his property, if you think about it in the north-south direction, his home and the barn is on more of the north end. And what we've done over the years is sort of parse that out into 3 separate lots. We've got the house lot, which is right next to the house. We're very creative here. We've got the north lot and the south lot, and it's still all St. Clair clone. And but the reason we do that is because they're going to ripen at different levels or times, and so we pick it. Sometimes they come in the same day. Sometimes it'll be a few days apart. But we separate it out. We ferment it separately, and then we're going to age it separately. And then our final G blend is going to be a combination of all those 3 different lots. And so what we try to do, this is sort of an insight into all of our Pinot Noir making. We don't want to get our ferments too hot. We don't want to over-extract too much tannin. And so we want to maintain the real pretty aromatics that you can get from Pinot Noir. That's why we're all here. We love this Pinot Noir especially. Don't tell our Cabernet friends to the north. But and so we then, after fermentation, so not too hot, want to maintain brightness, acidity. It's going to go down to barrel, and then 20%, maybe 25% some years of new French oak. The rest is going to be neutral. Our sort of philosophy or winemaking style is never going to be to smash the fruit down with oak. We want to, the way we think about oak barrels is that it's going to act like a pedestal, not something that's going to envelop the wine. And so we want to highlight, we want to elevate, to highlight the nuance of wine with oak barrels, but not crush any of that with too much of anything. We will have some flavors and aromas that can be, in particular, like with the G, sometimes we get this sort of wet tobacco flavor and aroma, and that's something that can be elevated through an oak barrel. But if we were to use too much, it might sort of turn it like a cigar box or something like that. It'll change that profile a little too much. Whether or not that's good or bad, that's up to you guys to decide. But
you can lose some of the freshness, right?
Yeah.
So some of the really fresh flavors that Pinot is known for. We've had certain vintages, certain wines that you almost feel like you have a bowl of cherries in front of you or a bowl of plums, like really fresh, beautiful fruit. And if you crush it with the smokiness of new oak, you lose that character.
Yeah.
And we feel like a lot of the vineyard blocks we have, we don't want to lose that character. We certainly are not trying to mask it with anything that's overly toasted. And so being pretty moderate with that new oak so that you still feel like you have that bowl of cherries in front of you.
Yeah, definitely. One interesting thing, and Brian and I mentioned it the other day, but with our 2018 G, typically our wines, our Pinots, get about 10 to 11 months in barrel. With the G this year, we even held it a little bit longer, ended up bottling it in the wintertime, just to add another sort of layer of complexity to it. So we'll get into that in a little bit, but should we move into some wines?
Yeah, let's do some wine.
So what we have here is basically a compilation of Chris and I, our time here at Bouchaine, working with the Gee Vineyard, starting in 2015, moving into 2018.
It's like a time capsule.
It is a time capsule. It's wonderful. So doesn't lack for color. The Gee Pinot is, I don't know, I guess it's a typical Pinot color. But again, going back to the talk on Monday where we talked about the Swan clone tends to have a real light color. This, the St. Clair is sort of going to be in between your Pomards and your Swan, where it, real great, I don't know, scarlet to it. There's so many different shades of color. It matches my lipsticks often. So
this 2015, kind of riffing off what Eric was saying, you love your kids all the same, but Dr. G will flat out tell you that 2015 is one of his favorite vintages. And almost every time he comes here, he's like, can I get another case of that? And I'm like, Dr. G, we're sold out. He's like, I know you got a little bit somewhere.
We found a few bottles today.
We found a few bottles today. Dr. G, if you're watching, we have a few more bottles. But this 2015 vintage was our first vintage here, really strong vintage. It was a little bit scary. So let's talk about fear and winemaking. We do pretty much the same thing every year, but it's going to change slightly depending on what Mother Nature gives you. And in 2015, we sat on the crush pad and we watched it hail. And so as things roll across the vineyard and you see hail popping down on the crush pad, if it's, 10, 15 seconds, you're like, oh, okay. And the first hailstorm was short, maybe not even 30 seconds. And it wasn't that big. And we were like, oh, it'd be great if it didn't hail, but it only hailed a little, like we should be fine. And we went and looked at the damage. The damage wasn't bad. But in 2015, it was cooler. And so bloom was really long. And as it hails, when that hail comes down and hits a flower on your cluster, you've just lost a berry. So you've just knocked that flower off, which would have turned into a grape berry. So every time it hails, you lose some crop. So the first hailstorm, no big deal. Yeah. Then we were sitting there and we saw the second one come through. This is maybe a week later, and it really hailed the second time. And it was a couple minutes, and it was long.
It's enough to make you worry.
Yeah, so then we just sat there staring at it, stomachs churning, and took a look at it afterwards. And there was definitely more scarring of shoots and damage to cluster. Now, the cool thing is you can knock these blooms off, which means you're losing crop. You can scar shoots with hail, and yet the vine will still produce fruit, and in 2015 produced amazing fruit. It was literally half the crop we would normally see, half. Yep. But it was delicious. It was amazing. It was a phenomenal vintage. It was just really short. So when you hear us talking about hail, about frost, yep. About, cold spells, heat spikes, et cetera, it's not that the vine can't come back from that. It's just that as folks who are making something from that product, we just get really nervous. We get really nervous. I have like 8 different weather apps on my phone, like watching radars and looking at weather constantly, because everything that we do is based on Mother Nature. So even if it's the same thing every year, the weather pattern in Mother Nature is different every year, which keeps you on your toes for sure. Oh, and this particular year was a really short year, but really lovely.
Yeah, sort of a winemaker's dream and a winery owner's nightmare, sort of. When your crop gets cut in half, you're going to make less wine, but it turned out to be just phenomenal fruit. And so 2015, this being our first vintage year, we're sort of thinking, oh, these crop levels aren't too bad, not too many barrels to take care of throughout the year. The crop's amazing. It was a great way to start a career here at Bouchaine, that's for sure.
Absolutely. And then how would you describe the 15 when you're tasting it?
2015 always has an added layer of complexity. I like to think of it as a density to the 15s. The profile is always going to be really similar in the Gee Vineyard. In a lineup, you can always pick out the Gee if you've got some experience with it, obviously. But there's this level of complexity, density to the 2015. So let's give them your cherry analogy.
Or the overview. Yeah. Okay. So we have little bullet points for each wine, right? And you can dig in and get more specific, but we have little bullet points for each wine. So the one that we talk about with Gee is if you were drinking a Manhattan at a really nice bar. So like you're drinking a phenomenal Manhattan, like in Manhattan, with the really nice Italian cherries, the dark ones that they put on your pick. Those are Morello cherries, and they just have this really cool tangy signature, and that Manhattan's got a little bit of a blood orangey flavor. Yeah. That is what, to me, encompasses Gee, yep. Where it's got that just tanginess and that blood oranginess, and then you describe it as like a black earth yep. note.
In my head, it just sort of appeared, and especially with this Gee Pinot, is a different signature of dirt essentially coming down to it. I write earth because it looks better in my tasting notes than dirt. But there's a black earth to it. And so I think a more rich soil that's maybe a little bit wet. And so the soil is not like that, in fact, but it's just the image that comes to my head. It's got this not a compost smell, but it's just like a rich, dark earth versus
After rain.
Yeah, exactly. There's a great word. I don't know if anybody's heard this one. It's called petrichor. And petrichor is the smell of the earth after rain. And it's like that. It's truly a beautiful smell. And so the G has that signature sort of dark earth petrichor smell. Other wines that we make have a lighter earth, I've said in my wine, or a drier, or in my notes, sorry. And so the G always has this dark earth. One of my recycled jokes is that I come from the Midwest and I have an older brother, and so I've tasted plenty of dirt in my life. And
Eric knows his dirt.
I know my dirt. But even as this opens up, it's got both of those signatures, along with that sort of bourbony cherry, Manhattan cherry. There's a freshness to it as well, and so these things are not mutually exclusive. Mm-hmm. A density versus a freshness can live in the same wine, and this is a real good example, I think, of that.
And when Eric's talking about earthy, people's familiarity with different items is how you describe things. So, for example, if you have never eaten a mushroom in your entire life, you're never going to say mushroom in a wine. But if you are addicted to chanterelles like we are, when you smell Dr. G's wine, that black earth that Eric mentioned, that kind of chanterelle note, like you'll pick that out. But even in other wines, if you have never eaten a bell pepper, you'll never say bell pepper when you describe things. You're going to describe it with what you're familiar with. And all of that is fine. There's no right way, there's no wrong way. We call out flavors and aromas just based on what we have intimate knowledge of. Yep. So you describe things slightly differently than I do. Although now that we've tasted together 5 years, we sort of have used each other's language a lot.
Definitely.
But if you don't pick up black earth, maybe your brother didn't put your face in it when you were young, and you're just not quite as familiar with it as Eric is.
Thanks, Matthew. All right,
That's awesome.
Go on to the 16. Gabe, you got
something? We do have a couple questions.
Oh, yeah, questions.
First question's from Tim again. He wants to know, is there a diversity or difference in soil between our property and G?
I think one of the biggest things that's created a difference, the soils are likely very similar. We have a little bit more topography, rolling hill nature to our vineyard, even though they're right across the street. The Gee Vineyard, where the St. Clair is specifically, is relatively flat, and the soils in Carneros aren't going to be particularly deep, 6-8 feet deep at the most in a lot of spaces out here, and then you're going to hit a clay hardpan, and that holds true in the Bouchaine estate as well. Like I said, we do have some more topography, our hills, our terraces, obviously, but something that's going to separate the vineyards is the way he's cultivated it over the years. What people tend to do when they dry farm is cultivate a bit more, and the reason they want to do it is to create a dust mulch layer, which is going to trap the moisture inside the vineyard, inside that soil profile. We're relying on rainfall throughout the winter time to provide for the vineyard. They're not going to stick a straw in the neighbor's irrigation. They're going to just rely on what's been given by Mother Nature. And so instead of letting that all sort of transpire, respire out, they evapotranspiration, there's a good word for you if you're doing any bar trivia on the vines, not likely. But that dust mulch layer is going to, hopefully, what it does is breaking up sort of the avenues the water can travel out of, and so it traps it in there. And so if you were to go grab a handful of dirt from Dr. G's vineyard, it's probably going to be a little softer on that top layer. And so it's just going to sort of have a look and feel that's different from our vineyard here. But another thing that we've done in our 5 years here is we've started using quite a bit of compost in the dormant season. After we harvest, we'll put on compost, and so we're trying to rejuvenate some of the health of the soil. And when you have a vineyard that's as old as ours. That's a lot of tractor passes, a lot of foot treading over your vineyard, and so you get some compaction. And one way you can do that, or mitigate that, is by planting cover crops that'll dig down, something like a daikon radish, which has a real deep taproot, breaks up any compaction, or other plants that are going to eventually get turned over into that soil, break it up. And so overall, I think the profile of the two vineyards is pretty similar. They're a clay loam soil type, but just through the cultivation, through the decades, almost 40 years, they're going to have a different appearance to them. I don't know. I
would totally agree, and then maybe add that we see a little more volcanic rock in ours.
Sure.
We don't. In our vineyard, there's a lot of this really cool, like orangey, pinky quartz, obsidian. And you just find these chunks walking around, and I don't see quite as much in Dr. G's vineyard. That would be like one little difference. But Eric's right. Like there's a certain level of topsoil, 2 feet, 6 feet, and then you hit like straight clay that unless your vine is 30 years old, you really are not driving into the clay with the root. But the roots will sit on top of it and pull water. And so we have great water holding capacity here,
definitely,
allowing us to dry farm.
Yeah. And this just speaks to like the wonderful nature of grape growing in the Napa Valley. Like Carneros maybe doesn't get quite as much credit as being as diverse in terroir as other areas with their steeper slopes. But the difference of a Dijon planted on the west end of our property versus on the terraces or on the east end, drastically different wines. And then you just pop across the road into Dr. G's vineyard, and different clones going to be drastically different. It just makes, especially Pinot, in our opinion, really diverse and fun. And as a winemaker, like if that's your canvas, then we're able to create some really fun and just interesting artwork over the years. So we like to consider ourselves artists, right?
Is there another question?
Yeah, there's the finished product. Kirsten would like to know, how long would you recommend aging the 20?
15 is shining right now.
Yeah.
And as wines sit in bottle, you've heard people talk about bottle age. It kind of rounds and softens the tannins. They get a little bit creamier. You get these secondary bottle characteristics, depending on the wine, you can describe it as leather, like a soft, like leather saddle. But the other thing that Eric and I talk about, especially with the Gee Vineyard, is it really pops these umami notes. And so I don't even know how to describe umami, but that beautiful tanginess is still there, but it's wrapped in this other layer of succulentness and
something.
Umami.
What is it? Sweet, sour, salty, bitter umami is in there as well. But it's hard to describe. It's it makes our job of difficult, interesting, fun all at the same time, is trying to relate these wines into words instead of just, yum.
Right.
The 16...
Although umami definitely equals yum. We can all agree on that.
For you, how about the 16? Do you have a real sort of
16.
highlight? For me, it's just got this... There's a vibrancy to the 16 right now that has just got it singing. The 15, just because I think of the age of it right now, is a little more brooding. Those cherry notes and the earthy notes are certainly there, and they are bright. Like I talked about, that density and the brightness all in one. That 15, I think, just because it's got some age on it, relatively young still, but it doesn't quite have this. The 16's got this just real zip of life right in the beginning, right on the palate especially.
It's got that real succulent, like blood orange and Morello cherry note that just like runs all the way across the palate, and then the whole side of my palate right now is watering. Like I just want to drink it. Mm-hmm. It's really, really, really pretty right now.
Did we answer the question? So 15.
Did we answer the question?
15. Yeah, it's
those really solid vintages. You can go 15 years on them, like no problem. When the acidity's there and the tannin's there and the density is there, like 15 years on a Pinot. If you like aged Pinot, just hang on to it.
Yeah, for sure. That's why, and put our sales hat on, it's always nice to buy multiple bottles of these wines so that you can taste something year after year. And if it's really great and it's perfect for your palate, you can open up the rest of them, or you can sit on it and just see how they evolve. The G's going to evolve really fun. I actually haven't tasted the 15 in over a year, just because it went away in our home, my home especially too. It just got consumed because, as I say, it's just one of our favorites. And so you can certainly sit on that 15, but it's tasting pretty great right now. I'm trying to think of what I would maybe do with it. It's as far as a dish, I don't know. It would be great with a burger, to be honest with you. So.
I don't know about you guys, but one of the main things I do on Facebook is just look at recipes. And somebody had taken a tenderloin and taken ground mushrooms, and you covered the tenderloin in mustard. You covered that in ground mushrooms. You then wrapped it in prosciutto and then stuck it in like a puff pastry dough. I swear I'm going to make this. And that, like, all that crazy flavor, beef, mushroom, the tanginess of mustard, pastry with this wine would be bananas. So I'm going to try it and then I'll report back. But I would think anything with mushroom.
Yep. A risotto.
Oh, risotto.
Yeah.
Oh, that would be so good.
Yeah.
Because the tanginess of Pinot Noir, the acidity of Pinot Noir really helps cut through some of the fat, right? And in risotto, you've got some cheese and you've got this kind of creaminess to the risotto rice. Pinot Noir is beautiful with that.
I'm going to pour the 17 in our other glass now, just so we can do some comparing and contrasting. And again, going back to the color of it all, not drastically different year in and year out. It's very loud.
This is so fresh right now.
Okay.
The 17 being younger is really like a big bowl of those beautiful black cherries when they first come on the market. Just so sweet and tangy and rich and yummy.
Yeah, this is very G to me. For me, it's just got that perfect black earth note to it. 17 was probably, in terms of crop level, an average year for us, I would say. Slightly over in some spots, but 15 being much lower, half. 16, 17 probably on par with average. Maybe a little bit below.
Right, 16 could have been a little short and 17 could have been closer to average. It rained a lot in 17, and for a dry farm vineyard, those vines were so happy. In Carneros, if we typically see 22 inches of rain a year on average, in 2017 it rained like over 40 inches. So the dry farm grapevines were like, yes, they were psyched. But to be honest with you, those older vines, like the Gee Vineyard or like the Chardonnay that we have here on our estate planted in 1981, those older vines, they really don't care.
Yep.
They are like old soldiers. They don't care if it's hot. They don't care if it's cold. They don't care if it's wet. They don't care if it's dry. They kind of bring you this beautiful fruit year in and year out.
Yeah.
Maybe a slightly different character depending on what Mother Nature gives you, but they are so solid. They've been, driving those roots down for decades, and they sort of just wing it. Yeah. Younger vineyards move around much more depending on what Mother Nature throws at you.
Yeah, more reactive like a teenager, whereas the sort of elder statesmen of Carneros with these 40-year-old vines, it's harder to throw curveballs at a vintage in general. 17, again, has a lot of liveliness for me, but it also has a real interesting sort of yin-yang of these a deeper black cherry with a fresh cherry note to it. It's this really interesting mashup of the two, really fun. And on the back end, sort of, if you think about the journey over a palate, you've got the entry and the mid palate and the finish, the back end. There's a really interesting sort of wet tobacco thing that's going on for me, which is, I love that.
And that fresh tobacco spice and kind of texture.
Yeah.
Super fun. Yeah, these G wines, coming from vines that are so old, they maintain a really, really lovely acidity as far as pairing with any type of food. If you need like a really tangy, but layered and complex red wine, like this is your go-to. Like Eric said, risotto is a dish that's incredibly layered. All that beautiful creaminess of the rice plus the bite of the rice a little bit, the cheese that you're putting in, whatever fresh veggies, mushrooms, bacon, whatever you put into your risotto. It's a really layered, complex, yummy dish, and it's sort of similar to this wine where you have all these beautiful layers.
Yeah, the tasting the 17 now too, as far as recipes go. What I like to do, especially with this wine, is barbecued pizza, where you take your dough, get it real thin, slap it on the grill grate, and let it go for about 3 minutes. And while that's going, you lightly olive oil the top, and then you flip it after 3 minutes, and then you put your toppings on there for about another 3-4 minutes, putting those mushrooms on there. Maybe some like a fennel sausage would go great with this too. So getting very hungry thinking about these things. So with that said, we should probably move on to the 2018.
18. So 18 was kind of a special year out here. 18 was also a wetter year, not quite as wet as 17, but wetter. And for 2018, like Eric said, instead of bottling the Gee Vineyard before harvest in August like we normally would, we held it. It just felt like the wine was really wound up, and it could use a little additional aging before going in the bottle. And so we held it until March. And bottled it February. Bottled at the end of February when we did our Vin Gris. There's only 50 cases this year.
Yep.
There's a tiny amount.
Operators are standing by. Get it while you can. It's
actually not even released yet, but if you email us and say, hey, we saw you on Facebook Live, then we'll break you out some.
Yeah.
But this is released in May. And it's just a really special wine because it's so small. Like we said, we deal with Mother Nature every year. Some years are really, really bountiful and you get whatever, 100, 200, 500 cases. And then other years, Mother Nature does something different and you get 50.
Yep.
So
exactly.
2018 is a 50 case year, kind of like 2015, which was short.
Yep. Typically, we would prefer to get more about 400 to 500 or so cases, maybe even 600 from the Gee Vineyard. But as the challenges come down the pipe, then we address them. And our goal, which is something that we really need to give credit to the Copelands for, is the directive from the first minute we've worked with Bouchaine has been to make the best wine possible. Mm-hmm. And so 50 cases is not a lot of wine, but it was the best blend and is the best blend that we were able to create from that. We still have to label it as such a baby, but it is already exhibiting those same things. Broken record over here, that dark earth, and there is a sweetness factor to it right now that is really fun, turning that sort of cherry into a sort of cherry cranberry, slight confection sweetness to it. Really interesting. Mixing that with those earthy tones that the Gee Vineyard is always going to produce. It's fun. And the color is even sort of younger right now too. Over time that'll change a little bit, but as we've cut, it's harder for you guys to see, but the color isn't really going to go up and down every year. It's pretty standard.
Stable.
Yep.
Yeah. And going back to what Eric was saying with, black earth and cherry, one of the really cool things about wine or pairing wine and food is that opposites do attract. Having something that's got a mushroomy, black earthy character, umami, with that bowl of fresh cherry, those two opposites and that yin and yang and pull of the wine just adds all these extra layers and complexity and just make it so interesting as you're drinking it. And the same thing with food pairing. Sometimes you do same, right? So you do some type of, let's call it the mushroom risotto with a wine that has a mushroom note or layer to it. But you can also do opposite. And so you can do things like our rosé I'll get to this one, but the first thing I think of is our rosé is like a lot of guava and fresh like wild strawberries, like little bits of almost like a nectarine note. And if you do that with something grilled, which is sort of the polar opposite, man, those two together can be amazing. What's sort of an opposite that you would say with this wine?
I'm having a hard time getting that pizza out of my head right now.
You could, but part of the reason that I think people pair duck or lamb with Pinot Noir is you've got this like meaty richness and that sort of like umami from duck or lamb. And when you pair it with a Pinot Noir, it pops the freshness of the cherry a lot of the time. And so you get this really bright, fresh cherry and this cool spice with like the umami and meatiness of lamb or duck.
Yeah, even like what's going through my head right now is sort of being spring. Today is overcast, but it's been real nice and sunny lately, and so like a fresh spinach salad with like a goat cheese and citrus dressing would be really nice with Gee, I think. So this is another one of those wines, and I think we could probably say this with the majority of our wines, is that they go great from sitting on your porch in a glass by itself to maybe a heavier meal and everywhere in between. They're meant to be drinkable and consumable, and if you want to sit on them for a little while, lay them down, then so be it. But they're meant to be approachable. That's I think a nice thing about our wines is that they're not made to just sit there in your cellar. They can and they will if you want them to, but they're open, they're fresh, and that's a word that I will use constantly in these talks is fresh. And the Gee, I think, holds true to that nature of our winemaking style.
Absolutely.
So, did we have any other questions, Gabe? We good?
If you guys do have questions, you can always write in the comment section of the Facebook page. I answer those questions half the time. Eric helps out with questions, so whoever answers it, it's probably going to be one of us. So feel free to put your comments there. I want to remind people, I know many of you are sheltering at home, and we are all in this together. So we have shipping for $1 right now. We've also had some virtual tasting kits that we've put together. That one of the kits was featured in the Washington Post yesterday. So if you want to send kits out and literally have a virtual tasting with your friends, family, colleagues, whatever. I did one a week or so ago. There were 8 different households. It was like a really crazy fun party virtually. So I know some of you guys are doing virtual happy hours. We're welcome to help, or we're happy to help you out with that, with some tasting kits if you're interested. And in general, if anyone needs some Gee Vineyard, just holler. We got all kinds of specials going right now for shipping and whatever else. We'd be happy to get you some Gee.
Yeah, definitely.
I don't know how much 15 we could find, but we have all the other ones.
It's a couple bottles, I think, around.
Right?
Nice. Well, if we don't have anything else, maybe we'll sign off for the day. But thank you, everybody, for joining. I can speak for myself, and hopefully Chris agrees, but we really enjoy doing these things. It's a nice way for us to feel at least like we're staying connected with our fan base that is so dedicated and fun, and we miss you guys, and we're looking forward to when this patio is full of people.
We'll invite Dr. Gee out. You guys we'll all keep sitting 6 feet apart, but Dr. Gee will at least be here to sign bottles and tell you some cool stories, because he's got all the best stories. Yeah,
he does. And you guys can sit here in front of this beautiful fireplace and see our new building, for those of you who haven't, and we'll be here and ready and waiting for you all. So with that, I guess we will say have a great weekend as much as you can. Call your parents, call your loved ones, call your friends, and stay connected, and be well.
And be well.
Take care.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.
Bye.